This week on NCTV, we continue our series about the history of U.S. presidents. This week, we learn about the first of Tennessee's 3 presidents, Andrew Jackson. He was born in 1767. Some historians claim his birth state was North Carolina. Others say South Carolina. Andrew Jackson rose from poverty to being elected our 7th president for 2 terms. I recently sat down with Trousdale County historian John Oliver to learn more about Old Hickory.
He was a first-generation American in that he was born here, but his parents were from Ireland. He had 2 older brothers, and the family was desperately poor. Unfortunately, his father died before he was born, and that drove him to even further poverty. In fact, his mother never owned a home. They lived with relatives, and they didn't live with relatives because the relatives said, "Oh, why don't you come stay with us?" They lived with relatives because they said, "You know what, you can come stay with us and we'll work you." And so his mother and brothers and he worked for these relatives. He never had anything. In fact, he said in later life that he did not remember ever as a child getting a gift. Birthday, Christmas, he never got a gift. However, they worked. His mother did work. It was tough. And we have a story that was passed down from a child who grew up with him years ago. It said that when they would wrestle as kids, and wrestling then wasn't to roll on the ground, it was to just grab your opponent and throw him to the ground. So if you got thrown to the ground, you lost, and you wrestled somebody else. That when they wrestled him, he wouldn't give up. He got tossed to the ground, he'd get back up and said, "All right, let's try it again." He was not a quitter, and that's evident, I guess, we see in a lot of other things he did. However, his mother struggled to make sure he got an education, that he learned to read and write, which was interesting because schools were not public then. They were private schools, and she saw to him that he got an education. In fact, she wanted to become a minister, and he actually got training in that direction. So he learned Latin as a child, but it was a struggle to pay for this because, like I say, they were living with family or with friends. The revolution breaks out, and his older brother Hugh, at 16, dies as a result of injuries in the revolution. Then we know this famous story, perhaps his most famous story, is that when he was 14 years old, he was asked to clean the boots of a British officer. He refused to. He said, "I'm going to clean your boots," and he probably threw an expletive in there, I don't know. The man picked up his sword and swung it at him. Andrew throws up his hand and is left with scars on his hand and his scalp for the rest of his life. His other brother then is told to clean the boots. He refuses, and the same officer takes his sword and pounds him on top of the head and knocks him unconscious. Now, the reason we mention this, you never hear this part of the story, the brother's injury got infected and he died from it a couple of weeks later. Then his mother, now all this is happening to Andrew Jackson within a few weeks of each other, his mother goes out of town to tend to relatives who are sick, and she dies. He didn't attend the funeral. He didn't know about it till afterwards. He never even found her grave. In later life, when he's successful, he made every effort he could to find his mother's grave. It's just lost. No telling where she was buried. I'm sure in a pauper's grave. All this, and he's 14 years old. What a struggle he had. Once again, he stayed with relatives, and he was hired out. But he continued his education, and oddly enough, studies to be a lawyer. Now, he didn't go to college to be a lawyer. He wouldn't have been able to afford to do that. But to be a lawyer back then, you read for the law, which meant you found another lawyer, you went in their office and you read their books, and they told you things. So he gets a law degree, and that's incredible with what he had to work with. At 21, he moves to the Cumberland settlements, which is where we are, Middle Tennessee. He took the Avery Trace. In fact, he was one of the very first people to travel the newly opened Avery Trace. Now, the Avery Trace is still pretty rough, and you didn't travel by yourself because there was the danger of not only thieves, but Indians. So he traveled with a bunch of people, and they got here safely to Nashville. What's interesting is that the very next group to travel the Avery Trace were attacked by Indians and massacred. Now, think how history would have changed if he had lingered and gone with that group. One of 2 things would have happened. We wouldn't have Andrew Jackson, or they would have survived the massacre, because with him, who knows? He was one of the first men to use the Avery Trace, got here, and he took a job of public prosecutor. Now, a public prosecutor is, he would be like a little judge, and he'd prosecute people. And here's a famous story that took place in Gallatin. He shows up for the day of trial, and one of the people charged with the crime is not there. He turns to the sheriff and says, "Where is he?" And the sheriff said, "Well, I went to get him and he wouldn't come." He said, "What do you mean he wouldn't come?" I said, "Well, he wouldn't come." Jackson said, "Did you threaten to shoot him?" I said, "Yeah, but he still wouldn't come." Jackson says, "Where does he live?" He said, "Well, a couple of miles down this way." Jackson gets up, gets on his horse with his guns, goes, and a while later he comes back with him. And so they have the trial. After the trial, the sheriff goes over to the guy and said, "What happened?" He said, "You wouldn't come for me." He said, "Well, Jackson threatened to shoot me." He said, "Well, I threatened to shoot you." He said, "Yeah, but there's something in his eyes that said he would do it." So that's a good clue to what Andrew Jackson was like. When he's in Nashville, and being the general prosecutor, he rooms with the widow of John Donaldson, who, of course, was one of the founders of Nashville. John Donaldson had a daughter named Rachel, and of course, you know their famous love story. Rachel was was married, but was separated from her husband, and she wanted a divorce. Now, they run off and elope, and they get married, and then, of course, then she gets the divorce. When he ran for president, this is quite a scandal, that he had run off with a married woman. So they concocted the story that it was an accident, that she thought she had gotten a divorce, that the paperwork was just bound up somewhere. But now the opposing theory is that they knew she didn't have a divorce. He was not going to get her a divorce because she found somebody else, and out of meanness. And so by getting married, that forced his hand to give her the divorce. Either way, he and Rachel were, of course, very deeply in love and stayed married, of course, the rest of their lives. He was a member of the first Constitutional Convention in 1796, the first representative from Tennessee in the U.S. Congress. A year later, he was a senator from Tennessee. Now, when he showed up in Philadelphia as a Tennessee senator, another man there was impressed with him. And here's what he wrote, exact words. "He was tall, lank, uncouth looking, with long locks of hair hanging over his face and a queue, which is like a ponytail, down his back tied in eelskin." But now, as rough looking as he was, or had the potential to look, he was a very smart man. And he was the kind of person who would see manners in educated people and pick them up, whereas some people would not even notice or would ignore them. So he quickly learned, he adapted very easily. In later years, William Martin of Dixon Springs, Colonel William Martin, said that, and he was quite old when he said this, that in his lifetime, he'd only met two men who acted as though they were born to rule. They were Colonel Benjamin Cleveland, who was the hero of the Battle of Kings Mountain, and Andrew Jackson. He said he just walked in a room and he assumed he was in charge. He was that kind of person. He was a judge of the Superior Court of Law for Tennessee, a general in the Tennessee militia, and of course we know about his defeating the Creek Indians, a major general in the U.S. Army, and of course the victor of the Battle of New Orleans, which of course catapulted him into national fame, which led to him being president of the United States. I have two stories about that battle. The Dell family of Salina, for whom Dell Hollow is named, one of the members of the Dell family was in the battle, and he quoted General Jackson as saying, "Don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes, and then aim at the spot where their galluses cross over their chest." And of course, galluses is another name for like suspenders, but it was part of their uniform. And if you see a red coat, they wore red with these big white galluses crossed right there. And he said, aim for that spot right there. And of course, it was effective because, we know, because the British casualties were 2,037 men. Now, casualties means wounded, dead, and missing. Americans only had 71 casualties, and only 13 of those were dead. Here's a song, words from a song that the men sang. This is actually 1814 lyrics. This is only part of the lyrics, but it's cute. "But Jackson, he was wide awake and wasn't scared at trifles, for well he knew what aim we take with our Kentucky rifles. So he led us down to Cypress Swamp. The ground was low and mucky, but there stood John Bull in martial pomp, but here was old Kentucky." So they won the battle. That victory, of course, made him a national hero, even though the battle actually took place after the war was over, but he didn't know that. But it was a big thing for America because that freed the Mississippi River up and made it American, which made America more look toward taking over the rest of the continent. He was a businessman. He owned stores in Gallatin, Donaldson, Clover Bottom area, and Lebanon. So he dabbled in a lot of things. He was a farmer. He had a large plantation. Of course, most people are familiar with his home, the Hermitage. He had about 150 slaves at the most at one time. but he was also very shrewd in his farming enterprise and was successful. And when he died, he left a very large estate after all his debts were paid. Unfortunately, his family were not as good at doing that. And after the Civil War, they lost the property, ended up selling it to the state of Tennessee on the condition that they continue to live there. And of course, which brings to him being a family man. He and his wife had no children, but they adopted one of her nephews, and then another nephew died, and they took his wife and children in. So the hermitage was occupied with kids. He loved the grandkids, even though they weren't his grandkids by blood. He also adopted an American Indian child named Lincoya. He was raising Lincoya as his own son. He found the baby after the battle, some battle against the Creek Indians, and was training him to be a tradesman, not to get a college education. But he died when he was a teenager, about 16 years. But he is buried in the Hermitage property. He was a horseman, and we know about that. And again, with horses, he did not like to lose. But he raced at Clover Bottom, which was his racetrack in outside Donaldson, and he also raced in Hartsville several times. So he was certainly familiar with this area. He was the last president to be a horse racer, to race horses. Toward the very end, he looked back and said, "After 8 years as president, I only have 2 regrets: that I have not shot Henry Clay or hanged John C. Calhoun."
Rachel was the love of his life, but sadly, she never had the chance to serve as First Lady during Jackson's presidency.
So the scandal about their marriage was brought up when he ran for president, and it was like muckraking. You know, the people who didn't want him to be elected accused him of everything, and supposedly it affected Rachel a lot that she was accused of this, and she dreaded going to Washington and appearing in public and people looking at her and talking behind her back, and so she died. And they say of a broken heart, stress, who knows. She may have been a little overweight at that time. She chewed tobacco. She was a pioneer for sure. And of course it broke his heart that happened. So she did not serve as First Lady. And so one of his nieces served for a while. He had, at the Hermitage, Rachel had a nice garden. He had a very nice tomb erected for her. And then he's, of course, buried next to her. It's funny because he never found his mother's grave, but he made sure his wife's grave was well marked. It's a very elaborate tomb, and of course that's all part of the Hermitage estate now. If you have not been to the Hermitage, it's well worth a visit because it is furnished pretty much like it was at that time. And I think that the Hermitage was the first American president's home to be preserved. If not, it was Mount Vernon, and he was second. It was right out there. He was elected twice. He almost won the election before that. It was a very close election. And he was the only president to nominate and secure the entire Supreme Court, the whole bench, and the only president in American history to pay off the debt. So that's why many people emulate him or try to emulate him because of that. He didn't believe in having debt. Yes, he was a successful president. You hear stories about him being kind of rough and uncouth, but actually it was more the people around him that were, because he was a very polished man. He's ranked up pretty high because of that, of course, paying off the debt would be one reason. I'm pretty sure he's always in the top 10. Yeah, it's interesting who the men who are in the top 10, but no, he's considered one of our better presidents for getting things done. He controlled the Bank of America. That was a big thing with him as well. There are very few things he didn't succeed at, and actually one of the things he did not succeed at was there was a racehorse named Mariah, which was from Trousdale County, the Sumner County line area, and he never defeated Mariah. And I think he raced his horses against Mariah 11 times and lost every time. But he did win a lot of times with his other horses, but he never beat Mariah.
Jackson died in 1845 at the Hermitage at the age of 78, surrounded by loved ones at his deathbed. His last words were, "Oh, do not cry, be good children, and we will all meet in heaven." Andrew Jackson, a true American patriot. In 2 weeks, we'll continue our look at U.S. presidents as we learn about our 8th president, Martin Van Buren. Reporting from Lafayette, Barry Hyatt, NCTV.